Hi, good evening. This is Sven Milošević. I'm a PhD student here at Main University. Welcome to this book panel, and I'm giving the word to Professor John Brennan, one of the organizers of this event.
Thank you very much indeed, Sven. Good evening, everybody. You're all extremely welcome to Maynooth University. As Sven said, I am the director of the Maynooth Centre for European and Eurasian Studies, the only such centre on the island of Ireland. And I'm also the director of the Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. We're delighted, in combination with our colleagues in the Maynooth University Social Sciences Institute and the Humanities and Arts Institute and the Department of History and Sociology, to host Jelena this evening. We are delighted that she is joining us. We would much have preferred to be doing this in person, but for a whole variety of reasons, we're not able to. We're delighted that with an online audience, we're able to reach more people. And I'm very much looking forward to both the launch of the book and to Jelena's précis of it, and John Paul and Sven's comments, as well as the contributions of people who will provide questions to our speaker. So we're delighted to be hosting the event, and I'll pass you back now to Sven to formally introduce our guest speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Our guest speaker today is presenting her book, which is called The Politics of Memory of the Second World War in Contemporary Serbia, Collaboration, Resistance, and Retribution. The author, Dr. Jelena Đureinović, is a postdoctoral, is a postdoc at the University of Vienna. She got her PhD at the University of Gießen on dealing on the topics of memory politics in the contemporary Serbia, and this book is a part of her PhD research that she developed after defending her PhD. And the book itself deals with very complex memory politics and memory actors at hand in present-day Serbia, but it doesn't limit to the present-day Serbia. It goes way back to the 80s and 90s, and her research is definitely one of the major importance for researching post-war societies of former Yugoslavia. So, without any more of my comments, I give the word to give the floor to Jelena. Jelena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sven. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for organizing the event. And of course, thanks to the Arts and Humanities Institute for hosting me as a visiting fellow this academic year. As John already said, I would also prefer it very much to have the first book talk in person, but this one also had to be online, unfortunately. And before I start talking about the book, I have to say, of course, to be fair, this book is not precisely new. It has been more than a year since it was officially published, and almost actually 2 years since it was printed by the publisher before the official publication date. But of course, the pandemic made everything different and made everything slow. So the end of 2021, we are still talking about the book. And going to share my PowerPoint now. Okay. I guess everything is fine. If there are some problems, do let me know. I'm also, I don't know how my Wi-Fi in this apartment is, so I hope that everything will be okay. So to start with probably the most important event when it comes to the research topic of reinterpretation of the Chetnik movement, and that's the rehabilitation case, court case of Dragoljub Draža Mihajlović that ended in May 2015, 9 years after the request for rehabilitation was filed to the court in Belgrade. Just a bit of a background, which is of course short and will not do it justice, but I hope that most of you are familiar, at least some basics about the Second World War in Yugoslavia. So Dragoljub Mihajlović was the leader of the royalist Yugoslav Army in the Homeland, which is usually and more commonly referred to as the Chetniks or the Chetnik movement during the Second World War in Yugoslavia. And what is interesting about the Chetniks is that they had support of the Allies until 1943, and they were officially actually representing the Yugoslav royal government in exile. But at the same time, they also engaged in collaboration and atrocities against civilians across the territory of Yugoslavia. Initially and officially a resistance movement at the beginning of the Second World War, the Chetniks actually dedicated most of their wartime efforts to fighting against the communist-led partisans or the People's Liberation Movement. And eventually at the end of the Second World War, and this is of course a simplification or a summary of it, the Chetniks were abandoned by the Allies, they were defeated by the partisans, and later in socialist Yugoslavia, they were considered war criminals, collaborators, and traitors. And in the context, in the Yugoslav memory culture where that focused on People's Liberation War, which was the struggle of the partisans led by the Communist Party of Yugoslavia against the occupation, but also it was a parallel socialist revolution that led to the establishment of socialist Yugoslavia. So what happened to Mihajlović after the war was that he was captured and he was sentenced to death in 1946, and he was executed. And the court decision from 2015 that I'm talking about here declared this indictment and conviction as politically and ideologically motivated and manipulated. This rehabilitation process did not, as it would normally, lead to some kind of compensation for the family of Dragoljub Mihajlović, for his descendants. It also did not resonate more widely in the public sphere, in the sphere of culture of remembrance, in through some kind of memorial, official memorial, or official holiday established to commemorate him. The significance of it is broader, throughout this process, the image of Mihajlović as a victim, as an innocent victim of communism, was continuously present in public and in media discourses. And the court decision to rehabilitate Mihajlović kind of made also this image of him as a victim official. And throughout the process that I followed, and I followed some other rehabilitation processes in person in courtrooms in Serbia. So during the process, the court counsel and the judge continuously emphasized that the case was only about the question whether Mihajlović was sentenced and executed because of political and ideological reasons. And as opposed to that, the Second World War was actually the main theme, even though everyone tried to distance themselves from that and saying that this is really only about the 1946 trial and not about reevaluation of the Chetnik movement. However, everyone who was involved in the process discussed the Chetnik movement, the nature of the Chetnik movement, their ideology, whether they collaborated, whether they committed crimes, and so on. And because of this focus on the wartime context, the court case was not really about correcting some kind of historical injustice, but it was more about re-evaluating the Second World War, but also socialist Yugoslavia in the courtroom context. And why this case was also interesting for me was that it involved multiple levels of memory politics and actors of multiple levels of memory politics, because The case was enabled by the legislation that was adopted by the parliament and that was proposed by the government. It was, however, initiated by the plaintiffs who were not state actors, but who were Mihailovic's grandson, together with a few anti-communist and Chetnik organizations and a couple of individual nationalist intellectuals. And then we also had historians as expert witnesses. And all but one historians who spoke in the courtroom were actually supporters of the rehabilitation process. And of course, this case can be also seen as a culmination of a very long process of political rehabilitation of the Chetniks and kind of legal confirmation of decades of their positive interpretation in Serbia. And the course naturally, the court case naturally reflected the hegemonic discourses about the Chetniks and their central position in official memory politics. And this is why this court case was actually the starting point for my research that then resulted eventually in the book we are talking about today. So the book's central question is how memory politics work. And I took the Chetnik movement as the main case study because of their radical revision and because of their central position in the context of the official memory politics. And the Chetniks actually became officially important and central to official memory politics in Serbia only after the fall of Slobodan Milošević in 2000. But this can be also seen as a culmination of, again, long process of the unmaking of the partisan myth and making of the Chetnik one. And the year 2000 represents a turn in the sense that the positive narratives that had existed in Serbian society, positive narratives about the Chetniks as both victims of communism and as anti-fascists, they rose to the official sphere and became hegemonic in society. And there was some kind of, after 2000, after the fall of Slobodan Milošević, and when this democratic coalition, a very heterogeneous democratic coalition came to power, they wanted to make some kind of clear cut with socialist Yugoslavia and its memory culture based on the partisans. And this is why the Second World War became the most important subject of revision. But of course, talking about this particular coalition and the parties that were ruling Serbia with majority in the first decade after 2000, it was also about Slobodan Milošević, actually, because while this coalition that came to power was very heterogeneous, they had a common goal of getting rid of Milošević, and also a common perception was seeing him as the last communist ruler of Serbia and seeing him as the continuation of the Yugoslav state socialism. So anti-communism in this context is also about Milošević. And the consensus, as I said, there was some kind of anti-communist consensus in this period, and it is a very important factor because what I consider one of the important contributions of this book, of my work, is that showing that the reinterpretation of the Chetnik movement in Serbia is not some kind of project of right-wing and far-right groups and parties and some marginal groups, as Chetnik followers are often simplified. Some of the most well-known pro-Chetnik actors or actors who claim continuity with the Chetnik movement, such as the Serbian Renewal Movement or the Serbian Radical Party or Ravna Gora movement, which is also active in Republika Srpska and Montenegro, they did not come together to politically and legally rehabilitate the Chetniks on their own, of course. And this is where I would really like to underline that the Chetniks are central to Serbia's official memory politics after 2000, and that some of state actors and political actors who distance themselves a bit from all that later, such as the Democratic Party and parties affiliated with it, they actually either initiated or strongly supported all initiatives that were revising history very radically after 2000. And if we only look at the parliamentary transcripts, we can really see that there is very marginal criticism and opposition within state institutions. And of course, when we talk about the Chetniks, and it is important to also emphasize that their image, we are not talking about one image, and that their image is very homogeneous. Here in the photo, you can see the first monarchist anti-fascist march from 2 years ago, for example. And you can really see that the image of the Chetniks is as diverse as the actors who promote it or who claim some kind of continuity. So here we have really a broad spectrum, going from perceiving Chetniks as the Yugoslav Democrats who admired Western democracies and just wanted to keep Yugoslavia together. And then on the other hand, we have celebration of their plan for ethnically homogeneous Serbia. So something completely opposite to that. And I won't go into details here, but there are also all sorts of interpretations of the Chetniks talking about them being for the European Union before the EU existed and so on. So this is a really, really heterogeneous sphere we are talking about here. And to say it in a more simple way, basically each actor that claims some kind of continuity with the Chetnik movement has their own draža, has their own version of the Chetniks and their own story about Dragoljub Mihajlović, whether that he was a fan of French literature and poetry, whether that he was into ethnically cleaning various parts of Yugoslavia and so on. So every actor, according to their own political purposes of appropriating the Chetniks, they kind of all have their image. And this was very important in the 90s during the wars, as well as when the revival of the Chetniks happened, but I'm not going to talk about that so much. So the book is, to summarize it really, the book is based on a twofold approach. And Sven mentioned it a little bit, that I'm a historian, so I use the diachronic approach, or history of memory, which is a very often neglected approach in memory studies, to look how the image of the Chetniks as victims of communism and as anti-fascists became official. And I traced back the long process of the, as I said, unmaking of the partisan myth and making of the Chetnik myth, or replacing it with the Chetnik myth, and how we got to the rehabilitation of Mihajlović in 2015. And then because this is a contemporary and ongoing topic, and as I was doing my PhD, the rehabilitation of Mihajlović was, for example, happening and ended as well. I simply made use of the contemporary nature of my research subject, and I also conducted ethnographically informed research, looking at the contemporary context, which is some kind of combination of course, archival research and collecting various documents pertaining to official memory politics, but also collecting doing interviews, observing various events, meetings, court cases, and so on. And here I focused on multiple levels of memory work, and from the official level to the anti-communist communities of memory from below. And here I would really like to use the opportunity to give a shout out to Brian Conway from Maynooth University, for whom I didn't know that he was actually at this university, whose work on Bloody Sunday, memory of the Bloody Sunday in Derry, has inspired this kind of multi-level approach to memory politics in my book. And as I said, I did look at the official memory politics, but I didn't focus only on that. And I wanted to see, to look at the central position and radical revision of the Chetniks at the core of official narratives. And if we look at the dominant discourses in the first decade, or in the first years after the fall of Milošević, we can see the image of the Chetniks as not only symbolizing the suffering. So Mihailović not only symbolizing the suffering of the Chetniks, but also Chetniks symbolizing the suffering of the Serbian people under communism. And this was all because Mihailović was sentenced to death and executed in 1946. And because many of them, of course, fled Yugoslavia at the end of the war. And following anti-totalitarian paradigm that is present across Central and Eastern Europe, Chetniks became the ideal historical reference because they could be constructed as an anti-communist and non-communist anti-fascist movement, but also innocent victims of communism, as I already mentioned. And according to this view, the Chetniks are really ideal in this post-socialist context because they fought kind of both totalitarianisms, and then they ended up as the victims of the communist one. And I looked at various state initiatives, but also at many forms of public representations of the post-war period and the Second World War. And if we look at any of the representations of the past that focus on victims of communism, they simply, in Serbia, they simply always revolve around the Chetniks. So this is the case with, for example, state-sponsored initiatives such as fact-finding commissions, with museums as well, with various media representations, and also with the anti-communist memory work from below. And as I said, this approach, this focus on the victimhood under the communist terror really reflects the broader context of Central and Eastern Europe, and we can see many examples of that. But what I found also interesting is that various state-sponsored initiatives, some of which I have mentioned today, really resemble mechanisms of transitional justice, and that includes rehabilitation acts and also that enabled rehabilitation of those considered victims of communism. And in the Serbian case, this always includes also defeated Second World War forces. And then, of course, there were investigative commissions that I also mentioned. And this was also interesting and really illuminates the central position of the Chetniks, because one state commission was established for basically everyone who was executed at the end of the Second World War. And then another commission was established by the government and the Ministry of Justice that focused only on searching for the remains of Dragoljub Mihailović. And this is one of the perfect examples that shows how important the Chetniks were for Serbia's memory politics. And there were also veteran laws, changes to veteran laws that formally equalized the partisans and the Chetniks. But this was really, while all these initiatives sound like transitional justice mechanisms, they actually did not lead to any concrete consequences for anyone related to somehow to the Chetnik movement or anyone considered victim of communism. No Chetnik has received pension for various procedural problems that simply actually disabled them from receiving any benefits. Restitution in most cases does not follow rehabilitation, meaning that rehabilitation really stays at the symbolic level. And investigative commissions failed to mark all graves that they wanted to mark, and their work was generally problematic, biased, and also very unprofessional and informal, which we can talk about later. And they also did not find the grave of Mihailović. There were a lot of sensationalist reports following the quest for Mihailović's grave, which is often referred to as the greatest Serbian secret. But the whole initiative ended in a series of very embarrassing failures, where they would find, for example, animal bones and right away claim that it was Mihailović, and so on. So when it comes to museums, just to mention a few different forms of historical representations in this period, in the case of Serbia, state museums, publicly funded museums, did not turn into something in House of Terror style, rather keeping the old exhibitions and then pasting the Chetniks onto them. And this is also something I can talk in more detail later. There was only one exhibition in this typical post-socialist House of Terror style, and it was a traveling exhibition and immensely popular, but it was not initiated and organized by the state. And of course, like if we look at wave of television programs that were dedicated to the communist terror in the early 2000s, they all focused on the Chetniks, and they all had, they traveled to the US, for example, found some still living Chetniks and interviewed them, even though the series would be called, for example, The Red Age, and it was actually about victimhood under communism more broadly. It always at the end comes down to the Chetniks. And I mentioned here that some of these measures did not lead to official memorials to the Chetniks. Actually, there are a few statues of Mihailović usually that were supported by local municipalities in small towns and villages in Serbia. And this is really a few, but no large government initiated memorials for Chetniks or victims of communism happened. And however, I first started noticing some individual cases, and then I tried to map as many as possible. And there are dozens, if not more, memorials across Serbia and in the neighboring countries as well, that were initiated, built, and financed by the either anti-communist community of memory or Chetnik community of memory from Serbia, or from they were often financed by the political immigration. And one of the examples, I have many, I will just show you one, which you can see in the photo. One of these examples is that illustrates this sphere that my research uncovered, is the golden statue of Mihailović here in the photo, which is in front of a monastery near Visegrad in Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this statue was built in Belgrade in '91. And it was taken to the Croatian city of Vukovar in '91, and it was placed at the entrance of the city in '92. And it remained there somewhere. I did not find exact information. I couldn't really reconstruct this part of the story, whether it was at the entrance of the city or where it was exactly for these 6 years, but it remained in, according to all sources that I consulted, in Vukovar until '98. And then it was moved to the Bosnian town of Brčko, as the then Serb administration in the city was facing the return of the non-Serb refugees, and they wanted to kind of symbolically secure the town by erecting this statue of Mihailović at a central location in the city. However, the golden Mihailović statue could not stay in Brčko either, because the city or the district of Brčko adopted a local law on monuments in 2003, stating that the monuments that don't have support of all three constituent nations could not remain on the publicly owned land. And then there was the idea to move the statue to the Orthodox cemetery, which is not publicly owned land but it belongs to the Serbian Orthodox Church. However, the local Ravna Gora movement removed the monument and then sent it to Visegrad and to their chapter in Visegrad. And the statue was then placed here near the location where Mihailović was captured in March 1946. And here we can see one of these levels of memory work that I talked about, because when the statue was revealed in 2004, on the anniversary of Mihailovic's death, there was the Ravna Gora movement from Serbia and also from Republika Srpska. They were mostly veterans of the 90s wars, actually. And the ceremony, the memorial ceremony, was performed by a metropolitan and he gave his blessing to the statue. And today this grew into a small memorial complex, which is on the church-owned ground, and where hundreds of Chetnik supporters gather every year, and it became in the meantime quite notorious in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And just to refer shortly, I think I still have a bit of time, to the anti-communist memory community that I was mentioning throughout the talk. So I tried to avoid perpetuating the kind of the dichotomic view that makes it seem that people who are into Chetniks and into defeated Second World War forces are some marginal groups in Serbian society who are also usually related somehow to the 90s wars. And the investigation of the Serbian case shows really that parts of the society consider the radical revision of the Second World War in Yugoslavia actually insufficiently radical. And these groups had made multiple demands for to the state institutions to actually go further in revision and policies and provide some kind of concrete policies. And as I said, I wanted to avoid something that we can consider a romantic dichotomy, where we have the imposed narratives from above and then opposition from below, because there is, of course, much more to the dynamics of memory politics. And we often hear the concept of memory activism as well being used, and it is always used to refer to some kind of liberal, leftist, and anti-nationalist groups. But however, if we look at just this case, as well as many others, we can see that memory activism can be very much illiberal, right-wing, far-right, and this is what I was interested in. And here you can see kind of the representatives of this group of what I call anti-communist community of memory. You can see the representatives of the Serbian Orthodox Church, the clergy. You can see the some members of the Karađorđević dynasty. You can see a handful of revisionist historians. You can see also some right-wing groups turned political parties like Dveri. Some of the intellectuals, nationalist intellectuals, became prominent in the 1980s in Serbia, and you can see different monarchist groups and so on. And this community commemorates the victims of post-war executions by the partisans, including the defeated military and political forces of the Second World War who faced retribution. And this, of course, includes the Chetniks as well. And since the emergence of this community within Serbia in public sphere, of course, in the 80s, they have engaged in memory work from below with different relations to the official memory politics always. And this is a very, of course, heterogeneous group that involves a wide range of political views, of historical interpretations, and personal relations to the post-war period as well, because some are family members, some are there only for the political reasons and so on. But what connects them is staunch anti-communism that seeks to first confront the communist past, and second, to fight communism that is perceived to be present in Serbian society today. And this is the reason why I call them the anti-communist community of memory, because this is a common denominator that brings these otherwise very different people together. And what was really interesting when it comes to this level of memory work is that these groups from below interact, of course, with official memory politics, and how they make some, through their participation, how they make some of the official mechanisms of dealing with the communist past, such as rehabilitation processes that they initiated, or investigative commissions where they took part as well, how they make these mechanisms more informal and hybrid and more amateur in a way. And I will be, of course, more than happy to talk about it in more detail later. And to conclude, what my research deals with and dealt with is anti-communism and something we can call anti-communist turn in the official memory politics in Serbia. But for the end, I would, of course, like to acknowledge, just that it doesn't go unmentioned, that Serbia's memory politics, official memory politics, has gone through another turn that we can term either authoritarian or populist. And in the last decade, where the Chetniks are not such a relevant historical reference anymore at the official level, and they were, when it comes to the Second World War, replaced with the appropriation of the Yugoslav Partisans, actually. And this is also something we can discuss. And for the end, what I was hoping to do here was, even though my study is really an in-depth study of the Serbian case, to provide some kind of implications that go beyond the case study. And I think that the book empirically explores the phenomenon of memory politics in a national context, of course, using really a variety of primary sources and approaches, and combines the historical perspective that illuminates the historical variability of memory, while pointing also to numerous continuities of narratives, practices, and actors, and combining this with the in-depth analysis of the contemporary memory politics in post-Milošević Serbia. And in doing so, the general aim of the book is to demonstrate the multiple levels of memory politics and how it works in society, how these different levels interact, but also the heterogeneity that actually underlines the mnemonic hegemony. Thank you all, and I'm looking forward to comments and questions.
Thank you, Jelena, for a great summary of your book. I know how it's hard to present such complicated topics in just over half an hour. You basically feel like the Charlie Kelly gif, where you're trying to explain the whole myriad of actors at hand. So now I'll turn to our discussant, Dr. John Paul Newman, who is the Associate Professor of the Modern European History here at MINUT, who will now give his comments and questions to the author about the book. John Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sven, for that introduction. I'll be pretty brief because I know I can see that questions are already popping up in the chat. So I really will speak for 10 minutes tops. I'm going to time myself, and then we'll go straight into the broader discussion about your work. But let me start by saying, Jelena, it's great to see you. I know because of storms and various mitigating factors, we haven't been able to have a real-life meeting yet. But it's great to have a scholar of your caliber and to have your kind of scholarship at MINUT. It's a great initiative of the Arts and Humanities Institute to have these visiting scholars, and long may it continue. It's gotten off to a great start. I have some questions about your book and some questions based on my reading of it and some of the things that you said this evening as well. I added a couple of points, but I might also try to nod towards the project that you're working on here at MINUT. And for those of you who haven't checked on the website, Jelena is beginning to work on socialist internationalism in Tito's Yugoslavia, particularly interested in the Communist War Veterans Associations, so-called SUBNOR. So I have a couple of questions that might nod towards them as well. So first of all, let me give the book its due praise. This is really a wonderful piece of memory scholarship. It really answers a huge number of questions, not just about the Serbian and the Western Balkan context, but also about the general European frames of memory. And really, I learned a lot from this, and anyone who does read this book will learn a lot. This is a major intervention into the field, and the book deserves all due credit for that. Jelena, when I read the book, in my reading of it, there are sort of three parts to it. This is how I kind of interpreted and understood your arguments. There's an opening section where you talk about the methodological and the theoretical implications of memory, and you apply them to Serbia. This is the beginning of the book. There's a central section where you undergo this extremely interesting historical analysis really beginning at the end of the Second World War, the beginning of Tito's Yugoslavia, right up, in fact, until the present day within Serbia. And as you say, your diachronic comparisons disaggregate these periods, and you show that there's a lot of currents and countercurrents, throughout these years. And then there's a final section which deals with institutional and legal frameworks. And you spoke a little bit about that at the beginning of your paper tonight, when you talked about the restitution of pensions and the legal process involving Milošević and the discrediting or the disavowal in Serbian courts of the process which led to Milošević's conviction and his execution. And so I'm saying all this, of course, not to explain your book back to you, but basically because my 4 or 5 questions are based on the various parts of your book as I understand it. I have a question about memory, I have a couple of questions about the historical section, and then finally I have a question about the institutional and legal frameworks. So beginning with the memory section, Jelena, here you give us an extremely sophisticated and elaborated discussion of memory and how it applies to the national and the European frames in the context of the Chetniks and contemporary Serbia. And you're interested in this, as you say, as you describe in the book, and you've mentioned in your talk this evening, is diachronic. You're making comparisons through time. But I had a couple of synchronic questions for you on this as well. I'd like to hear a little bit more, for want of a better term, about the Serbian world. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about how the memory of the Chetniks and Milošević is also reflected outside of Serbia. So within the Serbian minority, what's left of it in Croatia, in Serbian communities, in Bosnia, and perhaps even in the Serbian global diaspora. Now you do this to a certain extent in your book, and you have done this evening as well, with this fascinating story of the traveling statue, the traveling golden Milošević, who begins in Vukovar, then moves to Brčko, and then finally to Visegrad, and you talk a little bit about that. But perhaps you could tell us more about that. If there are significant differences in the way Milošević and the Chetniks are remembered in the various communities of Serbia, Serbian communities outside of Serbia proper. And the other synchronic comparison I'd be interested in is hearing a little bit more about the general experience of the Serbs in Serbia during the Second World War and the memories of those things. So I'm talking about the national state of salvation, Milan Medic. I'm interested to know how those memories compare to the Chetniks, how they're connected, how they're disconnected, what kind of memory work and what kind of memory manifestations there are, and perhaps even things like Zbor. I know that there's a more muted attempt to rehabilitate certain parts of Routledge in the Zbor movement. I think they're focusing on his hometown of Smederevo, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about that as well. I have 2 or 3 questions about the historical section. The first is coming back to the Chetniks. I wonder if you tell us a little bit more about the way, in your book, you speak about the memory of Chetniks and how this has changed and how this has altered since the end of the Second World War, right up, as I say, until contemporary Serbia. But I guess I'd be interested more in the period that comes before this. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that. You quite rightly say that the Second World War and the Chetniks are at the center of memory and memory studies and memory work in contemporary Serbia. But I wonder if there are any attempts when speaking about Chetnik memory to articulate all this or to embed this in a longer history of Serbia, going right back to the 19th century, the Ottoman period. How are the Chetniks narrated in this, if there is an attempt to sort of tell the story, I'm sure there is, of a much more general, much larger history of Serbia, where do the Chetniks fit into this story? And I guess I can have a few guesses or a few ideas about this, but I'd like to hear more about that. And then there's a very detailed point, a very specific point. You mention in the book that in 1961, and this is something I hadn't known actually, this is quite interesting, that the Museum of the National Revolution, which is now the Military Museum, I guess it's this one in Kalemegdan in Belgrade, was constituted and was formed in 1961. Now we kind of know that, don't we? And we know that from speaking about your new project on the war veterans, that's quite an important year in Yugoslav history. It's sort of the inauguration of the non-aligned movement. This is one thing, but it's also the year that SUBNOR, the amalgamated veteran association in Yugoslavia, is formed. Before that, there had been two separate movements, and it seems to be an important year, an important moment, an important pivot in the way, at least in communist Yugoslavia, the way the Second World War is understood and the way it's defined. So I wonder if that's probably more a question about your new project than it is about your book. But I wondered if you'd care to talk about that, and is 1961 indeed an important turning point? Now, there's quickly a bonus question that occurred to me whilst I was listening to your presentation, and that's about the heterogeneity of Chetnik memory. And you gave us this fascinating display of all the various parts of the Serbian political spectrum who attempted to sort of possess and define Mihailović and the Chetniks for their own. And of course, to a great extent, that reflects the fractured nature of contemporary Serbian public discourse and Serbian politics. But I wonder if this also has something to do with the fractured nature of the Chetnik movement itself, which of course was hydra-headed. It wasn't just a Ravnogorda movement; it was these various movements in Herzegovina and in Montenegro and in various parts of Bosnia. There was a political component, there was a military component. It's quite a chimerical movement. And this question is kind of inspired by a graduate student that I'm working with, Stephen Bozanic, who has been working on the political and the military origins of the Chetniks during the Second World War, and is starting to sort of refine our understanding of the heterogeneity. So I guess I'm asking, is this heterogeneity is this a function of the fractured nature of contemporary political discourse and public discourse in Serbia, or is there a sort of historical grounding in this as well? Does this have something to do with the heterogeneous nature of the Chetniks in the first place? And my final question is about the final part of your book, about legal and institutional frameworks. And it perhaps also relates not just to your book and your presentation tonight, but also to your new project, the one that you're working on with us at Manu. And I'd like to hear a little bit more. It's something that sort of comes from my own work of looking at SUBNOR and looking at social welfare, Tito's Yugoslavia. It's becoming very clear to me that the welfare policies, the way they're legislated and the way they're enacted, we can really tell a lot about the way a state wants to articulate its values, articulate its identity, articulate itself by looking closely at this sort of, these legislative matters, these legal matters. This seems to me, quite a useful way, quite a good way of seeing what a state wants to, project about itself, what it wants to sort of articulate as its core values and its core identity. So in a sense, that's a question about the war veterans that you're working on at the moment, legislation pertaining to them, to their welfare, to their position in Tito's, in society, in socialist Yugoslavia. How does legislation pertaining to them, what does that tell us about their position in Yugoslav society? What does that tell us about what Yugoslavia wants to, socialist Yugoslavia wants to say about itself? But I guess also with the sort of restitution of pensions in contemporary Serbia, these legal processes unraveling and undoing what had happened immediately at the end of the Second World War. What do you think this tells us about contemporary Serbia, about the sort of, the new values, the ideas, the identity that it wants to espouse? This seems to me particularly pertinent when I learned from your talk tonight that in fact there hasn't been any material welfare consequences of these policies. No pensions have been given. In fact, this only remains at a symbolic level. But it is perhaps at this symbolic level that these policies are most interesting, and they most eloquently sort of tell us what's happening in contemporary Serbia. So really, that's about all from me. Once again, thank you for taking the time tonight. I really enjoyed the book, really enjoyed the paper, and I'm looking forward to the continued discussion.
Thank you, John Paul, for so many interesting questions covering many things that I didn't get to say in the talk as well. I will try to go quickly through some of them. And you mentioned the heterogeneity of the Chetniks. I think it is precisely, they are, of course, such an easy object of revision because of their heterogeneous nature. And thank you for mentioning also Stevan Božanić, because there is finally someone writing about analyzing actually this diverse ideological nature of the Chetnik movement. Of course, I deal primarily with the Chetniks of Dragoljub Mihajlović, because they are at the core of Serbia's memory politics. And while all other different units and different commanders are always narrated as the wild units that did some crimes somewhere else, while the Chetniks surrounding Dragoljub Mihajlović are always represented as these honorable officers of the Royal Army that gathered him. And as thank you, Sven, for reminding me, as Serbian domaćini, which I have no idea how to translate, like, you know, really honorable men from the middle classes, and some honorable peasants as well, who were all, they did not, of course, commit crimes or collaborate honestly with anyone. And this heterogeneity also relates to the images of the Chetniks abroad, whether it is in Republika Srpska, in Montenegro, or in the political emigration and the descendants of the original Chetnik political emigration. And I actually wanted to explore Chetnik emigration and their memory culture and how they perform it through different cultural and sports activities throughout the PhD, but of course it was just not a reasonable goal. But I did look into some of the sources and everything, and it is really interesting how the present day community in the US that I mostly looked at uses different events such as the anniversary of Mihajlovic's death to really perform their Serbian American identity, and their most commemorations of the Chetnik movement are in a very 4th of July style, where we have fireworks, we have golf tournaments named after Mihajlović and so on. And this is really interesting, and this has been understudied because the Yugoslav political emigration has always been studied as, the enemy emigration during socialist Yugoslavia, and then later most of works we know, excellent works, focus on the exile terrorism, and we really don't have a lot of works, studies focusing on their memory work, especially when it comes to the Chetniks. When we look at Republika Srpska especially, and I think the great example for that is this Ravna Gora movement, the black-clad, uniformed, militarized organization that exists across the post-Yugoslav space. They have local and regional chapters. They march in columns, and these are mostly the veterans of the 90s wars, actually, and some of also younger men who were probably only born then or were like very young. And they exemplify the difference also between the perception of the Chetniks, broadly speaking, in Serbia in the sphere of official memory politics, and Republika Srpska, where in Serbia the dominant interpretation was based on anti-communism and didn't really relate so much with the 90s wars. And while if we look at the Ravna Gora movement, these veterans of the 90s, and also at Republika Srpska, we can see that it is always intertwined with the Serbian armed forces and paramilitaries in the 90s wars, especially in the war in Bosnia. And the recent mural to Ratko Mladić, where then mural of Dragoljub Mihajlović was added next to it, really also illuminates this section of the Chetnik memory community. I also looked at the other one, which is kind of more around the Serbian renewal movement, for example, and some people in the Democratic Party and so on that were praised Chetniks for their Yugoslav orientation, actually, as representatives of the Yugoslav Army, as representatives of something that could have become the parliamentary monarchy later, that could lead the European Union. And this is me paraphrasing some of the interviews that I did. And I don't know where to start now. Yeah, like if you look at some other defeated Second World War actors, Milan Nedić being a very prominent personality, of course, there was a parallel rehabilitation process of others as well. And Milan Nedić, there was a rehabilitation court case also going on for years that I followed, and I managed to go into the courtroom many times as well. And that one really escalated at some point and started involving dozens of various witnesses, historians. There was a woman who was 3 years old, who escaped the independent state of Croatia, and who was talking about it, how she wouldn't have been alive if Nedić hadn't saved her. So that it really escalated into some kind of circus where people were just like providing their own interpretations of history and so on. And I think for some of the more prominent political actors, it was important also to draw the line and say, of course, Mihajlović can be rehabilitated, and the Chetniks, some of them can be, but not Milan Nedić, because he was a collaborator, which only then emphasizes that the Chetniks weren't. And the same kind of differentiation happens within the Chetnik ranks when we talk about some other commanders that are known to have commanded over some crimes against civilians in Serbia, including Nikola Kalabic, whose rehabilitation case is, I think, still ongoing. This is also one of those cases that really escalated once people started inviting witnesses. And where, again, restitution was denied even before it was requested by the agency for restitution, because he was a proven war criminal. And you can see again this differentiation, who is and who isn't, because Dragoljub Mihajlović was rehabilitated. I think he is definitely rehabilitated, while others can be considered maybe war criminals and collaborators. And with Nedić, of course, we have the issue of the complicity of different structures in the collaborationist administrations in the Holocaust. And this is something that everyone in these circles will always deny. And yeah, but of course, it is, when it comes to Mihajlović, he actually had a public trial. We have court transcripts, we even have recordings. It is a completely different case if we talk about judicial rehabilitation. And I will maybe end with, I would also like to talk about the military museum, but also when it comes to the legal measures, you are right, it is about articulating values, because I think when different rehabilitation acts were passed that enabled rehabilitation of basically anyone, as long as you can argue that there were some ideological grounds involved in their persecution or repression or execution or whatever, I think no one really thought about these particular people or their families or anything about concrete consequences. It was really more for everyone at the symbolic level. And I interviewed judges. Judges were given 2 pages Rehabilitation Act from 2006 that didn't specify anything about the proceeding. They didn't know what to do. I remember the judge in the Nedić case asking about the gas van that killed Jews in Belgrade, asking like, what is that? What are you talking about? And like, she then had to, you could see as the case progressed that she had to go back to some books and read something about the Second World War in Serbia. So it was, no one really thought so far when passing the law, and with the veteran law as well. It was about articulating the values, articulating that Serbia had two anti-fascist movements, one led by the Communist Party, the other one nationalist. And then when it came to the actual pensions, that never happened. And this is one of the major causes for frustration among this memory community that I interviewed. I don't know, maybe I should leave some time for the audience, but I think the 1961 as the year at Military Museum. What is interesting about the Military Museum is how it looks like today. And this is one of my favorite examples of the museum transformation without transforming the Socialist Museum, where they kept, so the Military Museum was opened. Subnor is, of course, very much connected to it, was connected because it is a military museum, and Subnor was the main memory agent, official memory agent. And the Military Museum in Belgrade tells the whole history of the Balkans through the perspective of class struggle. And it is, the original exhibition exists today, and it is really interesting. And then I'm not sure when, if it was 2014. I'm not sure now. I'm sorry. It was anyway in the last decade, let's say so, that there was the exhibition was revised, and it was opened on the Victory Day on 9th of May, and the Chetniks were added. And sometime before that, they also added the NATO bombing, and they also added the war in Croatia, or more precisely, the crimes against Serbs in Croatia, in one small room at the end of the exhibition, which is something that you can see across actually the post-Yugoslav space, where in some of these Yugoslav museums, they just added the 90s in one room. And yeah, I will finish here. I will leave some time for the audience for their questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelena, and thank you, John Paul, of course, for all those really amazing questions. But we have a lot of them coming from the audience, which is great, because that's why we are here. So our colleague from DCU, Dr. Maria Folina, says she already kind of read half of your book, and it's a really great one. Part of her question you already answered, but she asks additionally, is there a procedure that is accessible to anyone who was not, who was persecuted, or their families? So is the procedure, so okay, will you maybe write down the questions and read a few of them, or you would go one by one?
Well, as you wish, I'm fine either way.
Okay, and then maybe I'll take two by two. Okay, the other one comes from Greg. Thank you for the presentation and for the book. Does the kind of memory work you describe here include rehabilitation of reputation, tend to occur in response to specific political conditions, or is it going on more or less in all the places at all times? In other words, is Serbia exceptional in the way or emblematic?
So when it comes to rehabilitation cases, there were two laws in 2006 and 2011 that were passed. And there were around 9,000 cases altogether at all courts in Serbia. And most of them, of course, do not concern any historical actors that all of us here know about. And most of them never reached any kind of, never had any kind of media attention. And so there was, I mentioned the exhibition, which was called In the Name of the People, which Srđan Cvetković, who was also leading the State Commission for uncovering secret graves of the executed. And this commission provided support for family members, and then they used the that continued beyond the commission's work, actually, and their mandate. They continued meeting. People would come to the Institute of Contemporary History and queue in front of his office, and then they would provide them where they could go and how they can submit a request. The procedure is quite simple. And however, when it comes to some of the political and military actors we are talking about today, family members are often not even involved. If they are involved, they're also at the same time also political actors. They are not just family members seeking justice. In the case of Milan Nedić, his great-great-son is a member of Dveri, so this far-right group turned political party, and he was also running in elections in Niš. And in the case of Mihailović, his grandson, who is now in this monarchist group that I showed, the anti-fascist monarchist march, he actually left the process after the first proceeding, and only people who were left were politically motivated. So when it comes to these small-scale cases that concern not prominent historical actors, it is family members, but in other cases, some of the most relevant cases do not have anything to do with families seeking facts or justice or restitution. And when it comes to the other question, I don't know how to answer it shortly, actually. Of course, Serbian case reflects the broader transnational trends in regarding memory politics. But it also has some specificities, of course. And what I was talking about today can really be placed in the context of the anti-totalitarian memory politics at the level of both the EU, but also individual Central and East European countries. And we can also see it across the post-Yugoslav space. But on the other hand, of course, if we talk about specificities, we do have Chetniks as a specificity, but we can draw parallels with some other Second World War movements that were also ambiguous, that are also revised and so on, in Poland, in Ukraine, and after all, also in West European countries, of course.
Okay, thank you. So second round of questions. So Davide Denti says it's a very interesting presentation, and he would like to hear more about why the SNS regime, so the current government in power, abandoned the Chetniks and reappropriated the partisans instead. How much of this is about domestic factors, and how much is this about the international legitimation strategies? I think, you know, probably Russia being here the most important player there, kind of targeting, I presume. And another question comes from John Dorney. Is the idea of rehabilitation of historical figures a legacy of state socialism and its idea of correct historical interpretation? Is there still an assumption in Serbia that the state should have an official position on historical events? Also, Dr. Đureinović mentions that Chetniks give an equal standing with the partisans. Does this mean partisans are still officially seen as the legitimate national liberation movement? Okay, so.
Thank you all for interesting questions. Of course, the current regime, I wouldn't say they abandoned the Chetniks. They were among the strongest proponents of their rehabilitation and reinterpretation during the early 2000s. They didn't really separate from that at all. They just don't talk about it. And the focus of the official memory politics when it comes to the Second World War shifted towards two things: celebrations of the victory of fascism, meaning victory against fascism, meaning the partisans, but of course in a different, not in their real communist and Yugoslav and multi-ethnic version and revolutionary, but rather as a Serbian victorious army in the Second World War. And then the other side of the Second World War experience, which is commemorated through also various forms of cultural production and So one is the victimhood in the independent state of Croatia. And of course, when it comes to appropriation of the partisans, this is both related to the international and domestic political factors. The international, of course, most obvious being the relations with Russia. And we can see that I wouldn't say that, of course, that this starts in 2012 when the Serbian Progressive Party comes to power, but it starts a few years earlier, as this, what I mentioned, the anti-Milošević factor and component of anti-communism starts to weaken a little bit towards the end of the first decade of after 2000, as the Socialist Party of Serbia, the Milošević's party, starts also gaining more traction. In 2008, they sign some kind of declaration of political reconciliation with the Democratic Party. In 2009, there's a first large-scale celebration of the liberation of Belgrade, of course, with prominent guests from Russia as well. So this is all intertwined. And I do have an article coming out in Memory Studies soon with my colleague Jade McGlynn that focuses really on the Russian-Serbian memory diplomacy and how this all works at the international level. And I will be happy to send it to you if you just write to me in the chat or contact me or whatever. And for rehabilitation and legacies, this is the question that bothered me quite a lot. And but when I trace back the discourses and the mentions of legal rehabilitation in the Serbian case, I found the lawyers' chamber in Serbia talking about legal rehabilitation already in the early 90s and in the late 80s in different weekly magazines. And then they started getting together and actually advocating for some kind of mechanism of legal rehabilitation for their former member, Slobodan Milošević. And so the whole mechanism of rehabilitation later kind of emerged from lawyers who are also very much active, including Kosta Čavoški, who are very much active in this anti-communist memory community. And the lawyer who represented the plaintiffs in both Nedić and Mihajlović's case is member of the Royal Council as well of the Karađorđević dynasty, but also, sorry for laughing, but also he was also the head of the chamber in Serbia for a while. And I think the agency and activism of lawyers, of nationalist lawyers and legal scholars in Serbia and in Yugoslavia in the 80s is often overlooked because this is why so many of these measures are also legal and not in the form of mere declarations, for example, in the Serbian case.
Okay, so I'm starting to feel a little bit like Mickey Mouse in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, fighting the brooms, fighting the questions coming in. So now I'll read you three questions. So first one is from Pierras McHenry. I'm sorry if I mispronounced this name. So thank you for a fascinating lecture. I look forward to reading your book. I was a member of a small UNDP team in Serbia 2 years ago, looking at issues of depopulation and migration. After 1 week visit, our delegation was invited to the palace of President Vučić. We were surprised on entering to see a map on the wall, not of Serbia, but of Croatia, showing clearly those towns and regions with significant Serb population. My question, are there links between those who want to see greater Serbia and the debates about Chetnik's World War II and memory? Then we have Ana Kršinić-Lozica. Thank you for a super interesting talk. Can you say something more about the authoritarian populist turn that you mentioned? In what ways it reappropriates the partisan resistance movement? And is it also entangled with the memory of the 90s war? Would you say this populist turn has the same characteristics in Serbia and Republika Srpska? So those two questions are kind of connected. And the third question comes from Stevan Bozanic from across the sea. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak about your work, Jelena. Thank you so much. Can you explain a little bit more about the role of historians in the process of rehabilitation? And actually, you discussed this quite thoroughly in your book, so I think you'll have an answer for that. So, and then after this, we'll have a final set of, I think, 2 or 3 questions which are in the chat, so I have to dig them out. So back to you, Jelena.
Thank you. I will try to be now really short. Well, the greater Serbia idea, I don't know about the, I would have to see the map to be able to say something specifically about that. But when it comes to the Chetniks, as I said, there are different groups within this broadly defined Chetnik community of memory. And for many of them, and especially for those who relate the memory of the Chetniks of the Second World War with the Chetnik revival during the 90s wars, they do see the idea of greater homogeneous Serbia as something to strive for or something to lament about the past. So that it hasn't been reached. So of course this is a very important segment in that. In some part of it, as I said, not in all of them. And when it comes to the authoritarian or populist turn, it is very much related to the 90s wars, of course, but not because it has something to do with the partisans directly, but more because the 90s wars became, for the first time, really the focus of the official memory politics. The previous governments never really commemorated, or to say it right, they never really celebrated the military participation in the 90s wars, and this now changes. And this then relates to the partisans because the Serbian political actors, the state representatives, promote the concept of Serbia's liberation wars, Oslobodilački ratovi Srbije, which merges a series of uprisings, both world wars and the 90s wars, into one notion of liberation wars, meaning, of course, that any, if you put the 90s there, and 90s are in the state program for commemorating these liberation wars of Serbia, meaning that the Serbian armed forces that they were always fighting for liberation and that all their wars were always defensive. And this is what it simply comes down to. This is, of course, I wouldn't now go into the theoretical discussion about why this is populist and how, but definitely we can see through the level of cultural production, we can see it in the emergence of some new, very large scale commemorative practices in the last 10 years, nine years, that there is something more authoritarian, of course, about the memory work of the current government. And it is, I think we can also draw parallels, of course, with Republika Srpska, especially because many of the commemorations of the 90s wars and the victimhood of Serbs in Croatia during the independent state of Croatia are actually co-organized with Republika Srpska. And this is not just having Milorad Dodik as a guest, but it is always jointly organized, and it is then streamed live on public broadcasters in both regions. They are partners in this memory politics, through the idea, not to elaborate too much on that, of this Serbian world and uniting Republika Srpska and Republic of Serbia into one culture of remembrance. And Stevan, thank you for your question about historians. Historians served as expert witnesses, even though in Serbian legal system, this kind of expert witness that we know from some of the, such as David Irving trial and so on, this doesn't really exist in Serbia's legal system. And I was already contacted by several legal scholars criticizing me for calling them expert witnesses because this doesn't exist. But there is no other way. They call themselves that way. And there is no other way to describe them because they weren't direct witnesses, but they provided, of course, more legitimacy to rehabilitation cases. And it is usually all cases that were processed according to the first 2006 laws were one-sided, meaning that only historians who support the rehabilitation can speak there. And in some others that turned into a mess, which is, for example, Kalabic case taking place in Vranje, that was done, that has been done by the based on the 2011 law, which allows two sides, which means that everyone can basically invite everyone. And there were some historians, some great colleagues who are critical of these of historical revisionism who were testifying, if I may say testifying, including Slobodan Milošević and Milan Radanović. And this is really important because the cases I followed before, it was really like some of the things, this kind of, I wouldn't call it revisionism or misinterpretation. It was really falsification of facts in the courtroom, in front of the judge or the court counsel that doesn't really know and can only hear one side. And it was really outrageous. Although, like, we can, of course, talk about the basic question whether these cases should take place in this form at all and whether historians should be testifying in such court cases. And this is a broader, I think, question for us in the discipline to discuss. And it is a never-ending question, of course, when it comes to the ICTY, when it comes to the Holocaust denial trials and various other things, what our role as historians is. It is completely different testifying in a trial that concerns the Holocaust denial and testifying in favor of someone's rehabilitation, I think.
Okay, and we have one more question from Professor Jelena Đureinović from the University of Zagreb. So, how does your work relate to already published work by Milan Radanović, who you just mentioned, and Jelena Subotić? If you can, please specify what are the main differences between your book and their work on the topic. And I'll just abuse my position a little bit more, and I'll ask you a few questions of mine. So first of all, just a short comment that a lot of the things that you wrote about how courts kind of, I wouldn't say hijack, but try to smuggle some of the ideological representations of history within the kind of legal texts reminds me a little bit on the process against Dinko Šakić before the Croatian courts in 98, 99. You even had the cases, I think Viktor Ivančić wrote about that, when the judge would stop somebody from giving some interpretation, which was seen as going out of the scope of the, the indictment against, but you could see that it really tries to protect some historical narrative, historical truth about, certain historical events. And the more concrete questions are, first of all, I'm actually glad that you mentioned that you try to focus on memory actors as somebody's not coming from left liberal circles, but more from like conservatives or even far right circles, which is something that's maybe not done as much, in our region. And I wanted to ask you, why is there, for example, a perception in, for example, Croatia, that all this kind of Chetnik revival is only reserved for like the Milošević period, and also for like the Vučić period, let's say. So if you would ask a common person, when were those laws passed, I bet that everybody would say either in the Milošević era or in the Vučić era. Nobody would say that's basically the liberal Serbia. I mean, technically, it was the most liberal option, in power in that basically a decade. And, this is, I know that, the historians don't like those questions, what if, but, would those processes be any different if Đinđić was in power? Was his position, ideological position on, this anti-communism, this kind of, liberal anti-communism, was it different from other parties that basically as you said, it wasn't the radicals, the SPO, or some groups that passed those laws. It was the DS, DSS, and other parties which were either in the center or center right, which were more, let's say, moderate political options rather than radicals. And also, a question is that you kind of mention in your book this will to do a reconciliation within the Serbian nation. So it kind of reminds me on those kind of projects in Croatia, in contemporary Croatia, which were tried by Franjo Tuđman between the Ustasha and the Partisans. And just a short and simple question, is that really about reconciliation? And this question is maybe more for the broader audience here that maybe don't, are not familiar with the dynamics of the 90s. And I'll end here.
Okay, I mean, I'm of course very familiar with the work of both Milan Radanović and Jelena Subotić. And when it comes to the book Kazna and Zločin by Milan Radanović, this is the groundwork that concerns historical sources pertaining to the Second World War, and not he doesn't really deal with memory politics. So I think our work complements each other in that way. And without his work, I think many of our own studies on memory politics wouldn't be so not possible, but not so easy, because he really laid the kind of work he did in that book is really essential. And when it comes to the book by Jelena Subotić, actually, she deals with the Holocaust memory. I don't deal with the Holocaust memory at all, but I think here even more because our books do complement each other. However, she also has a more transnational approach coming from international studies and looking at other countries, including Lithuania and Poland, while I focus on Serbia. And we were in touch when we were both working on books, actually, and because both of us had some questions. And this is these two books, I think, should be read together for the complete understanding of the memory of the Second World War in Serbia, because she focuses on the appropriation or reappropriation of the Holocaust memory for nationalist purposes in Serbia, while I look at the Chetniks and also the reappropriation of the Partisans and more of this military participation. I think when it comes to, there is always Sven's questions are also great. And when it comes to Đinđić, first, of course, if he was anti-communist as well. And this is something that often when I speak somewhere about it, and when I have the photo of Đinđić taking down the 5-pointed star in '97, then people get a bit riled up about it. Anti-communism can be liberal. Anti-communism can be many things. Anti-communism doesn't have to be far right. And anti-communism in Serbia doesn't always have to really focus on the Chetniks. When it comes to Đinđić, we can see him in the early 90s at various gatherings to commemorate victims of communism that were emerging then. And generally, Democratic Party members were already in the early 90s gathering at churches, for example, and so on, at different commemorations, speaking at them as well. And I don't want to go into the what if thing, but I think it is important to remember that it was the political party that he was in, that he led, that actually initiated everything I talked about today when it comes to the post-2000 period. And the first thing he did in '97, when he won the elections in Belgrade, was to take down the 5-pointed star, the petokraka, from the building of the city of Belgrade, of the city council of Belgrade. And when it comes to Croatia, this misconception might also arise from the fact that both the memory politics of the 90s and historical discourses that were dominant in the 90s and those related to the Serbian Progressive Party are more tackling Croatia and being more aggressive towards Croatia. I think if we look at if we look at the present day commemorations of Operation Storm, for example, this is both Vučić but Dodik as well, but Aleksandar Vučić is often really directing his speeches at Croatia in general, at all of Croatia, all Croatian people and so on, threatening that no one is going to attack or humiliate Serbia ever again. So I think this is maybe why people have this misconception. And again, I think people often forget about liberal anti-communism, and they often forget about the failure of the civil society, liberal civil society in Serbia to deal with the post-war period, to deal with the period of consolidation of Yugoslav state socialism and the repression and everything, leaving it completely to be hijacked by the more conservative, the far right and the right wing and so on. And so there are a lot of misconceptions there, of course, and no one wants to talk now about the current opposition that some people are hoping for them to take over power in Serbia. That might seem better than the current government to someone that they were also, they initiated the rehabilitation of the Chetniks. It wasn't Aleksandar Vučić and Tomislav Nikolić, Vojislav Šešelj and Vuk Drašković. It is, as my book explains, I think it is part of the political consensus about memory politics and about historical references the Serbian nation state should look up to.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And I think we'll slowly end here. We've had really a wonderful discussion here, a lot of questions coming from all over Europe and abroad. So, and I hope that all of these people read your book and they, kind of maybe make some book reviews. That would be also kind of useful. And I would thank, yeah.
I would just add that the paperback edition is coming out in 5 days exactly, making the book finally affordable, actually, for not only for the university libraries, but also for.
Give us a link, Jelena, into the website in the chat. Don't be modest. We all the rest of us want to see this and read this affordable, excellent book.
Okay, I need some time to get the link.
Maybe I can find it.
Yeah, John Paul, if you can post it, that would be great, because I get redirected to the University of Vienna library right away, so it's not a right link.
Okay, I had it a moment ago, Jelena, but it's gone. I'm going to tweet that on Musi, on Maynooth University Social Sciences Institute. I'll tweet that there, so there will be a link. And I think it's about 35 euros. There we go. Anne is way ahead of both of us. She's got quicker fingers on the keyboard. So there it is, and it's extremely affordable. And there's no excuse now not to own. Perfect stocking filler, I think.
Okay, now you all have the link. Now you can all get the book. I would once more thank Jelena for joining us. We're really, we're really sorry that we couldn't make this in physical presence. But anyway, I think it was a very great discussion, and maybe a lot of questions couldn't come in if we were only in Maynooth. So maybe that was a plus on our side. And I wish you all the best of luck in your time spent in Maynooth, working with John Paul. So thank you all, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sven. Thank you, Jelena.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.